Well, good morning. This is the Lew Rockwell Show, and it's so great to have John Denson as our guest. John has been a judge. He's a very successful defense lawyer in Opelika, Alabama, but just as important to us, great scholar, author of A Century of War, editor of The Cost of War, another great book on the evil of the American presidency. John's a student of war, about the evil of war, very, very deeply read in it, and it's so great that he comes on the show occasionally to talk to us about some of the important books that he's read. Last time you talked to us about some very important books, and I know maybe you're going to talk to us today about even more important books in the cause of peace and against war and destruction, murder, and really the destruction of civilization. I'll just mention before we go that the great Robert Higgs argues, and he's talked about this at the Mises Institute and also on this show, that the U.S. government has actually got the ability and maybe even the ambition to blow up the world. I mean, they're sort of unconstrained, and they believe they should rule the world. And we face a very scary situation. So this is just not a matter of history. History is very important. It's important to know what evil things have been done in the past and how we might avoid them in the future. But really, this warfare mentality, the warfare state, the militarism, the constant indoctrination of evil as a good thing, threatens all our lives, threatens our children, our grandchildren, threatens everybody in the world. This is so important to try to educate people about the truth about war.
Well, thank you. This is sort of a follow-up on a theme of a book I started in the first part we did some time ago, and this is a book, Worshipping the Myths of World War II, Reflections on America's Dedication to War by Edward Wood, Jr., and he points out how we need to dispel the myths coming out of World War II, and we need to think about war in a completely different way. So today I'd like to give you some of my ideas on the steps that we should take in thinking about war in a different way in order to diminish the likelihood or possibility of war. And basically that's what my book, A Century of War, is about, is that revisionism is a key to peace. We need to tell people the truth about the horror of war and how the horrible World War II was, so that that myth of a good war doesn't propel us into more war in the future. And secondly, revisionism is to show the real causes of the war, not the ones that they tell us were the cause of the war, but the real causes of the war and what the real effects are. This talk, I'd like to show you there's two parts of the strategy of a new way to talk about war and to think about it. Start off with the idea that World War II was mainly a war against civilians, and the main people that were killing civilians were the bombing by the British and the Americans. And contrary to what most people think, is the mythology is that Hitler started bombing cities in England, but it was Winston Churchill became prime minister in May of 1940, and the very next day he ordered that the bombing of German cities and civilians be started. And his justification of that was that it's going to destroy the morale of the German people, and they will demand that war come to an end. They got a dictatorship, and they think the people are going to take charge of the dictatorship. But one of the reasons that he didn't state is that England was not sufficiently committed to the war, because a lot of people didn't see where England should have declared war against Germany over the invasion of Poland.
And not against the Soviet Union, which had also invaded Poland.
That's right. 2 weeks later, the Russians invade. But, it was called the phony war. Nothing went on after England and France declared war on Germany. Mm-hmm. So one of Churchill's ideas was that, look, if we can bomb German cities and then get Hitler to retaliate and bomb British cities, then that'll make the British people more committed to the war. And then we'll tell them that the Germans started it, So
remember when Roosevelt got us into the war against Japan, he immediately sent bombers to bomb Tokyo. This is the allegedly heroic Colonel Doolittle in the Doolittle raid. The Japanese, of course, had done a horrible thing in bombing Pearl Harbor, but they didn't kill any civilians. The only civilians who were killed by Americans shooting at the Japanese and hitting American neighborhoods near Pearl Harbor. So Roosevelt immediately started bombing Tokyo. I mean, that was the first thing he did, killing civilians.
Yeah.
So Churchill, of course, started it.
Well, that's right. A book that will give you the British side in favor of bombing is called Bombing Vindicated, a survey of recent developments in the leading authority on air warfare, published in 1944 by J.M. Spate. And that's a defense of the bombing that the British were doing.
Isn't that interesting? They felt they had to make a defense.
Yeah.
Sure, there must have been people having the right views.
Yeah, because I think you got to be known. Look, everybody's just bombing cities. Why not military targets? You know, one thing you think about the British people were not fully committed to the war is that a lot of the royal family were very much against the war. And that was one of the reasons that Rudolf Hess thought that he had some chance to make a peace mission. He was led to believe, it appears, that he might be able to meet with key people in England and reach a peace treaty. So he was supposed to land at one of the royal family's airports in Scotland. And because Churchill found out about this, and Churchill was put in office by people that would not accept anything but complete Hitler annihilation of Nazis. So there's no chance of peace. So he immediately got Hess and put him under house arrest in prison for the entire time of the war.
And well beyond, of course.
And well beyond, yeah, the rest of his life, and probably was murdered at the end. But anyway, there was a group in England that were not sufficiently committed to the war, and Churchill knew it. Of course, the Duke of Windsor, was removed allegedly because he married a divorced woman from America, but really it was that he was not. He actually visited with Hitler and didn't really feel like Britain needed to be in that war. So they made a change. But that's one book you can look at to get the side that the British thought was the reason to start bombing. Here's some good books to read that will give you the survey of what was going on by the British and the Americans in bombing Germany, and then finally the Americans bombing Japan. Richard Overy wrote a book called The Bombers and the Bombed, Allied War over Europe 1940 to 45, and another book, Wings of Judgment, American Bombing in World War II by Ronald Schaefer. And here's a book I think that is important. This is a book called To Destroy a City, The Strategic Bombing and Its Human Consequences in World War II by Herman Nell. This is a civilian who is in one of the German cities, and he tells you what he saw, the children being killed, the women and so forth. It was not a military target. And I think that's what people don't have a sense of, because we didn't see any bombing in America. I think it's important to read books like this that tell you what the bombing of Germany was like from a viewpoint of a person that was bombed. Another excellent book by a philosopher is Among the Dead Cities, The History and Moral Legacy of World War II Bombing of Civilians in Germany and Japan. It's by A.C. Grayling. Something I want to strongly recommend is that you get the DVD and the book called The Fog of War. This is an interview with Robert McNamara, and he is Exhibit A of why this was not the greatest generation. He helped plan the bombing of the German cities, but he and Curtis LeMay planned the firebombing of Japan. Now, there was firebombing of Dresden and Hamburg in Germany. But when they got to Japan, the houses were made of such flammable material that they thought they could start with incendiary bombs and just create a firestorm. And I didn't know this until I read the book and saw the movie. McNamara says that not only did they firebomb Tokyo, but they firebombed 66 cities and killed over 1 million civilians. And you can see this is as a confession where he's sort of seeking redemption by his confession. I realize what I've done now. And he said Curtis LeMay told him, he says, Bob, if we lose this war, you and I will be tried as war criminals because we're just killing civilians. We're killing children and women. It's an excellent movie. The movie is done by Errol Morris, and the book is just as good as the movie. Of course, another major thing is to get to the decision to use the atomic bomb. And we now know Douglas MacArthur had a 40-page memorandum that he gave to Roosevelt before Roosevelt to the Yalta Conference. And it showed that MacArthur was in touch with the Japanese to the extent that he knew that they were willing to surrender if they could keep their emperor and not have him tried as a war criminal. Admiral Leahy knew Roosevelt very well, and he knew that Roosevelt would never tell anybody he had that memorandum. So Leahy got a copy and gave it to a newspaper reporter named Walter Trohan, who wrote for the Chicago Tribune.
Sure, yes.
On the condition that he not write about it till after the war. So, of course, if Roosevelt had taken that and accepted that surrender, that would have kept Russia out of the war completely. Because all that Roosevelt was trying to do at Yalta, he wasn't successful about this until Yalta, was get Russia to agree to get into the war with Japan, which they agreed to do 3 months after Germany was beat, and support the UN. And Stalin had not been for those two ideas. They had a peace treaty with Japan, and it stayed in effect until the Germans were beat. So that's all that Roosevelt wanted. He didn't care what he had to give away. It's almost like Wilson in World War I, where he was willing to give away everything to get his League of Nations. And I think that wanting the UN was the essential thing that motivated Roosevelt throughout. He wanted a war, and he wanted to have a UN. He wanted allegedly to be to create world peace and make him the greatest man in the world. So he goes to Yalta, gives away everything. Finally, Herbert Hoover meets with Truman in 1945 after Roosevelt's death. He said, "Are you aware of this MacArthur memorandum?" He says, "Yeah." "Well, why don't you accept it?" "No, I'm going to stick with unconditional surrender." So anyway, the bomb is tested in July. Truman sticks with unconditional surrender. When the bomb explodes, he said, "This is the greatest thing in the world." You know, he thinks this is wonderful. It's just wiping out civilians. Had already firebombed 66 cities. They had a hard time finding a target. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were two of the few cities that hadn't been bombed. So it was a completely useless act. And we've been told that if we didn't drop the bombs, we'd have to have an invasion, or we'd lose 1 million soldiers. And so this book, The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb by Gar Alperovitz, is one of the best that I've read, and it gives you
it's a great book.
Great book. I think so, too. Another book I would recommend is the same thing I said about the German citizens, is Hiroshima Diary. This is written by a doctor who was present when Hiroshima was bombed. And he saw the women and the children. He was actually hurt himself. And this is what I think you need to do, is see the world from the other side, the other front porch of the other person. And it's a heart-rending book to read about what he saw and what he experienced. And that's, again, something that Americans are just not shown. When they first publicized the bombing, it just shows you buildings were destroyed completely. It left out all the horrible details about the children and the women made. It was not a military target. So Hiroshima Diary, Journal of a Japanese Physician, August 6 through September 30 of 1945, by Michiko Hachiya. I guess it's Hachiya, MD. That, to me, is the first part of my strategy, is to show the horror of World War II and the horror of what a World War III would be with nuclear weapons. The second part of my strategy that I think we need to think about war is what were the real causes and what were the real effects. So I want to start off with a book that came out a couple of years ago that I've been looking for some time. I take a journal from the Hoover Institute, shows what books they're going to publish. For many years, they've been talking about a book that Herbert Hoover was going to release that he said could be released about 50 years after his death, and the time came up and it didn't come out. But finally it was published, and it's called Freedom Betrayed, Herbert Hoover's Secret History of the Second World War and Its Aftermath. And it's got an excellent introduction by George H. Nash. But Hoover was on to Roosevelt very early, that he could see that Roosevelt was trying to get a war started in Europe, and he was trying to wanted to get America into it. And so he decided to run for president, try to get the nomination in 1940. I know you and I have talked about a book called Desperate Deception. Mm-hmm. It's a story about how the people sabotaged his campaign so that Wendell Willkie would be the Republican candidate. And he had no problem with Roosevelt's foreign policy. In fact, he was a one-worlder anyway.
Yeah.
So Hoover was not successful in getting that nomination. And we know also from the actions of Intrepid, who was an agent of the British, that Churchill got money from the royal family to send Intrepid and his group into America in 1939 to try to get America into the war. Now, Hoover saw their tracks, but when he was writing this book, he didn't know that they were in the Rockefeller Center cooperating completely with Roosevelt to get America into the war. That was their sole purpose. This is an excellent book, and I want to talk about a conversation that Herbert Hoover had with Joe Kennedy, who was the ambassador to England under Roosevelt from 1938 to 1940. But to understand the significance of that conversation, I want to talk about World War I and the Treaty of Versailles to show exactly the cause that leads up to World War II. The Germans were led to believe by a pre-armistice agreement on November 5 that the Allies, that means America, England, and France, were willing to enter into a negotiated treaty based on the 14 points. That was the basis in which the Germans said, okay, we'll put down our arms and we'll walk back to Germany. Germany had not been invaded. Well, they didn't negotiate the treaty. It was dictated to them. There were no 14 points to it. And the reparations were left completely open. They just said, send us money, we'll tell you when to stop. But they started cutting up Germany. They split it in half, and they split East Prussia off and created a corridor for Poland up to the Baltic Sea, and then made Denson, a German city, available to Poland. Well, one of the 14 points was to recreate Poland. Poland had been destroyed and taken over by 3 countries in the 18th century, so that was one of the main points, is to recreate Poland and then give them a corridor to the Baltic Sea with a seaport of Denson. People just thought this is one of the many things that's really bad, and also they put German-speaking people into Czechoslovakia and create a country that from scratch with the Czechs in control that nobody wanted to be there. So Czechoslovakia was a newly created country, just sort of like the British did in Iraq. They drew a circle around 3 warring tribes and called it a country of Iraq. So there were these very unfair.
Also, because all based on the idea that Germany was solely responsible for World War I, when we know, of course, that France and Russia and Britain as well were also responsible.
Exactly. And I'm glad you mentioned that. Did you know that John Foster Dulles wrote the War Guilt Clause?
No, that monster, of course, yeah.
He and Allen Dulles, I read this in that new book by Kinzer on the Dulles brothers. But their uncle was Lansing Secretary of State, so he brought both of them to Paris for the peace conference and let John Foster write the War Guilt Clause. Let me talk about that a little bit because it's so similar to what happens here and that Hoover's going to talk about. You remember there was an assassin from Serbia, supposedly an agent of Serbian government, that assassinates the Archduke of Austria and his wife. So Austria demands an investigation and the demand that somebody be prosecuted and pay reparations and so forth, and they got a guarantee from Germany that we'll back you up. And so Austria gets a little hubris there and makes a demand that they be allowed to go into Serbia and make their own investigation inside the sovereignty of Serbia. And they disagree with that. So Austria declares war because they've got a guarantee from Germany. Well, when that happens, Russia considers themselves as the saviors of the Slavs, so they mobilize and pull all their troops up to the border. When Germany sees that, they pull their troops up, and the war gets started, mainly because of this guarantee that Austria had from Germany. So that's what's going to happen in the story that Hoover tells. There's a very interesting guy that's involved.
France was promoting the war, too. I mean, they were active in wanting a war.
There's a very interesting guy that's involved in both of these things, and his name is William Bullitt.
Oh, sure.
William Bullitt was a delegate to the peace conference. He had very high hopes for Wilson. He was a big fan of Wilson's. When he saw the terms of the treaty, he resigned and wrote Wilson a pretty rough letter. And I want to read some of that because you'll see how unfair Germany was treated. He says, this is dated May 17, 1919. You can find this in a book that was published in 1966 called Woodrow Wilson, A Psychological Study. Of all things, the co-author is Sigmund Freud.
Sure, yeah.
Who hated Wilson. But anyway, this is a Bullitt's letter. And he later becomes ambassador to France under Roosevelt. And he participates in starting World War II. But here's what he thought about the Treaty of Versailles. He said, "My dear President, I've submitted today to the Secretary of State my resignation as Assistant Department of State, attaché to Americans, commissioned to negotiate peace. I was one of the millions who trusted confidently and implicitly in your leadership and believed that you would take nothing less than a permanent peace based upon unselfish and unbiased justice. But our government has consented now to deliver the suffering people of the world to new oppressions, subjections, dismemberments, a new century of war. I can convince myself no longer that the effective labor for a new world order is possible as a servant of this government. Russia was the acid test of goodwill for me as for you, has not even been understood. Unjust decisions of the conference in regard to Shantung, which was in China, Tyrol, which was in Italy, Thrace, Hungary, East Prussia, and Danzig." Now, he's talking about the corridor, how unfair it was to create that corridor and to take Danzig away. And then he talks about the Saar Valley and the abandonment of principal freedom of the sea. He said, "It is my conviction that the present League of Nations will be unable or powerless to prevent these wars, and that the United States will be involved in them by the obligation undertaken in the covenant of the League and in special understanding with France. Therefore, the duty of the government of the United States to its own people and to mankind is to refuse to sign this treaty or to ratify this unjust treaty, to refuse to guarantee its settlements for entering the League of Nations, and refuse to entangle the United States further by its understanding with France." That was echoed by one of the delegates from England. Harold Nicholson wrote a book called Peacemaking, 1919. And, of course, John Maynard Keynes wrote The Economic Consequences of Peace. So the delegates were shocked at the unfairness of this treaty, especially as it applied to Germany. So here's Bullitt. That's his opinion about it at the time. Let's get back to Herbert Hoover's book, Freedom Betrayed. He's keeping up with Roosevelt all the way through the war, of course. And he has a meeting with Joe Kennedy. Hoover lived at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel his whole life. And this is in May of 1945. Joe Kennedy served as ambassador to France under Roosevelt from 38 to 40. Roosevelt recalled him. Kennedy was very much against America getting into the war, but he was taking orders from Roosevelt. So here's what Hoover says Kennedy told him about what happened and how the war started in Europe. Kennedy then discussed the book that he's been engaged in writing on his official experiences as ambassador to Great Britain. He told me he had some 900 dispatches which he could not print without the consent of the American government. He's hoping that time would come when he could print these and going to prepare a book and put it away until the time is right. He said the book would put an entirely different color on the process of how America got into the war and would prove the betrayal of the American people by Franklin Roosevelt. Kennedy said that the Germans had occupied Prague and the great cry of appeasement had sprung up in the world, and after the Germans had pressed their demands for Danzig and a passage through the corridor, that Roosevelt and Bullitt were the major factors in the British making their guarantee to Poland and becoming involved in the war. Kennedy said that Bullitt, under instructions from Roosevelt, was constantly urging the Poles not to make terms with Germany, and that Kennedy, under instruction from Roosevelt, was constantly urging the British to make a guarantee to the Poles. So even though Bullitt, as a delegate, knew that Hitler's demands about the corridor and Danzig were just, and that the Poles should accept that, he's telling the Poles, do not negotiate, don't agree. And then he's telling Kennedy to tell the British, you guarantee to back up the Poles. It's the same way World War I started. It's this guarantee that we'll back you up about negotiations. Continue with the conversation as reported by Hoover. Kennedy saw Chamberlain on numerous occasions, urging him in Roosevelt's name to do all that he could, with the implication that the United States would then give the British support. So if the British got into the war, then he's giving them a guarantee. He said that after Chamberlain had given these guarantees, Chamberlain told Kennedy that he hoped the Americans and the Jews would now be satisfied, but that he, Chamberlain, felt that he had signed the doom of civilization. Kennedy claimed he was constantly urging Roosevelt not to be engaged in this question, but his urgings were to no avail. Kennedy said that if it had not been for Roosevelt, the British would not have made this the most gigantic blunder in history. Kennedy agreed with me that the Germans were a land people, that they had given up the possibility of sea conquest. They built up a land army for expansion purposes, and that they knew they could not spread out to the west, and that they had determined to expand into the Balkan states and to Russia. Chamberlain knew this, and Kennedy said that Chamberlain's whole idea, despite Roosevelt's promises, was to keep hands off and to let these two dictators fight it out. In the great book by Hanson Baldwin, Great Mistakes of the War, he says that America and Britain and France should have stayed out and let Hitler and Stalin fight it out. Finally, he says, Kennedy told me that he thought Roosevelt was in communication with Churchill, who was the leader of opposition to Chamberlain before Chamberlain was thrown out of the office, and that afterwards, before Chamberlain died, Chamberlain had written to Kennedy a 9-page handwritten letter saying that the original policies that Kennedy and his were like views, had they been adopted, would have saved the world and prevented the war. So it shows you Roosevelt's big role in bringing about the war in Europe. You know, we know a lot about Pearl Harbor, but he's the instigator of the war starting in Europe between Poland, France, and Germany, with these telling the Poles not to negotiate, and then making England give a guarantee, and America gives a guarantee. And I've read elsewhere that the Cuban Declaration of War by France was in violation of their constitution. They were supposed to have gotten Parliament's permission and did not do it. There's another place that Kennedy talks to somebody and has a conversation with him, and that's in the Forrestal diaries. James Forrestal was the Secretary of Navy during the war, and then after the war, he was made the first Secretary of Defense, and he was very much opposed to Truman. He and Secretary of State George Marshall both went to Truman and told him not to recognize the State of Israel and not to support the creation of the State of Israel. And he said that Marshall said that would tie our foreign policy to Israel from now on and be the biggest mistake we could make. And Forrestal had let it be known that he was going to write a book. He was going to resign as Secretary of Defense. He was going to buy a newspaper, a very wealthy man. And he was going to write a book about his opposition to these policies of Truman. And so he was fired. And he went to see his friend Lovett on vacation in Florida, and they decided he needed to go to the hospital. So he goes to Bethesda Hospital from fatigue.
Lovett was one of the wise men, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And of course, Forrestal had made his money the same way with the wise men. He'd been on the broker, Brown Harriman, I think, or something. So he checks in, and they don't let him see a lot of people. Won't even let him see his brother. But while he's there, they go into his office and confiscate his diary. And it's a loose-leaf diary, and they take it to the White House and they purge it from all the things that they think are bad, but they left in something they may have thought was insignificant. It was a golf game he had with Joe Kennedy in December of 1945. And this is what his diary says. Played golf with Joe Kennedy, who was Roosevelt's ambassador to Great Britain in the years immediately following the war. I asked him about his conversations with Roosevelt and Neville Chamberlain from 1938 on. He said that Chamberlain's position in 1938 was that England had nothing with which to fight, and that she could not risk going to war with Hitler. Kennedy's view that Hitler would have fought Russia without any later conflict with England if it had not been for Bullitt and Roosevelt, he puts a bracket, Bullitt was ambassador to France, urging on England in the summer of 1959 that the Germans must be face down about Poland. Neither the French nor the British would have made Poland a cause of war if it had not been for the constant needling from Washington. Bullitt said he kept telling Roosevelt that the Germans wouldn't fight. Kennedy said that they would, and that they would overrun Europe. Chamberlain, he says, stated that America and the world Jews had forced England into the war. In this telephone conversation with Roosevelt in the summer of 1939, the president kept telling him to put some iron up Chamberlain's backside. Kennedy's response was always that putting iron up the backside did no good unless the British had some iron with which to fight, and they did not. Looking backward, there's an undoubted foundation for Kennedy's belief that Hitler's attack would have been deflected to Russia. In other words, he's saying that but for Roosevelt's interference through Bullitt and talking to the British, there would have been just a war between Hitler and Russia. So the Forrestal Diary is interesting. It's also interesting that on the day the Forrestal was to be released, he allegedly committed suicide by jumping out of the 16th floor window of the hospital. There's a book called The Death of James Forrestal, First Secretary of Defense by Cornell Simpson. It's the first time I've seen a person commit suicide twice. When the body was found, there was a towel wrapped around his neck tightly and knotted in the back, which meant he was strangled. And then he jumped out the window. So obviously he was murdered. So that they said he was going to be released later that morning. This was 1 o'clock in the morning that he's pushed out of the window. So that gives you some indication of Roosevelt's role in getting the war started. Now, also in Freedom Betrayed, Hoover talks about it was all Roosevelt's fault for getting the Japanese war going. And he was very aware of all the screws that were being placed by Roosevelt that we now know from Day of Deceit by Stinnett were in place from a memorandum. But Hoover was aware, he didn't know all about it, but he could see these actions cutting off the oil. And he says the main mistake was a refusal to meet with Prince Kenobi, Prime Minister of Japan, who was desperately trying to reach an agreement with America. And so Roosevelt had been baiting the Germans, trying to get in the war through the front door. And when he couldn't do it, he got in through the back door. That's the theme of Freedom Betrayed, written by Herbert Hoover, and shows the horrible things that Roosevelt did to get us into the war. Let me close by just recommending two books by Gabriel Kalko.
Oh, great Kalko.
A World in Crisis, The End of the American Century. And a second book is The Age of War. The United States Confronts the World. Let's read a little bit of Kalko's book. He says, the United States has power without wisdom and cannot, despite its repeated experiences, recognize the limits of its ultra-sophisticated military technology. The result has been folly and hatred, which is a recipe for disaster. September 11 confirmed that, and war has come to its shores. Skipping down, this is reading page 176. The problems, as the history of the past century shows, are much greater than the U.S. role in the world. But at the present time, its actions are decisive, and whether there's war or peace will be decided far more often in Washington than any other place. Ultimately, there will not be peace in the world unless all nations relinquish war as an instrument of policy, not only because of ethical or moral reasons, but because wars, plural, have become deadlier and more destructive of social institutions. A precondition of peace is for nations not to attempt to impose their visions on others, adjudicate their differences, and never to assume that their need for economic or strategic resources of another country warrants interference of any sort in its internal affairs. But September 11 proved that after a half-century of interventions, the United States has managed to provoke increasing hatred, in other words, blowback. Mm-hmm. It has failed abysmally to bring peace and security to the world. Its role is that of a rogue superpower, and its promiscuous, cynical interventionism has been spectacularly unsuccessful, even on its own terms. It is squandering vast economic resources and has now endangered the physical security of Americans at home. And I want to read one more part of the book that I started with by Edward Wood, Worshipping the Myths of World War II. He says at page 164, Can we at last finally learn that evil lies in ourselves as well as others, and that World War II had other causes besides appeasement? Can we do away with our beliefs in apocalyptic thinking, acting as though our purity was the only answer for the world? Can we realize that making war in this modern era will always involve killing innocents and causing atrocities, always release dark, destructive, and corrupt emotions deep within ourselves? It is time for us to understand that it is completely sensible for citizens of Europe to say no to the war in Iraq and to President Bush's unilateral attack. The memories of the murderous qualities of war that began in 1914 and ended in 1945 ran too deep for them to easily accept apocalyptic thinking and the idea of war that might trigger even greater conflagrations. It is time to begin to work in concert and cooperation with other nations to cover new ways of thinking and acting beyond the myths of World War II. As long as we believe that evil lies in others and that war is the only means to justice, we will continue to wreak havoc on the world. It is time for us to change. So that's my take on his book of the strategy of showing the horror of war, the reasons we get into war and what it causes. And it's time to us to start thinking about war as people started thinking about slavery, that it can be diminished and hopefully abolished.
Well, John, thanks so much for coming on the show today and talking to us about the horrors of war and about all these important books. And it's great to have you. And next time you have a list of other important war books, I hope you'll come back.
All right. Thank you very much. I always enjoy it.
Well, thanks so much for listening to the Lew Rockwell Show today. Take a look at all the podcasts. There have been hundreds of them. There's a link on the LRC front page. Thank you.